Welcome back to Rockstock Channel. It is Wednesday, August 21st. Following up on our recent interview about copper with Anglo American's Paul Gate, Rodney and I are diving deeper today into the massive growth in the solar industry as a demand driver for lithium, copper, and other energy metals. The Economist magazine published a long essay in July which caught our eye, entitled Sun Machines. The article quoted extensively from today's guest, Morgan Bazilian, who is professor of public policy at the Colorado School of Mines in Denver and director of the Payne Institute. Morgan has over 2 decades of experience in energy, natural resources, and environmental policy and international affairs. He has published over 180 papers, and his 2008 book, Analytical Methods for Energy Diversity and Security, is a seminal work in the field. The Payne Institute is sponsoring its Critical Minerals Symposium in Denver, September 12th and 13th, at which a large number of representatives from mining companies, government officials, and investors will be attending. Check out the show notes below for a link to the symposium if you have interest to attend. We've also provided a link to the Economist essay from which I'll share a few quotes before Rodney will dig in with his questions. Quoting from the article, in 2024, the world will make something like 70 billion solar cells, which will provide power to family homes, to local electricity collectives, to specific industrial installations, and to large electric grids. They will sit unnoticed on roofs, charmingly outside rural schools, controversially across pristine deserts, prosaically on the balconies of blocks of flats, and in almost every setting imaginable. Once in place, they will sit there for decades, making no noise, emitting no fumes, using no resources, costing almost nothing, and generating power. Over the course of 2023, the world's solar cells, their panels currently covering less than 10,000 square kilometers, produced about 1,600 terawatt hours of energy, representing about 6% of the electricity generated worldwide. Buying and installing solar panels is currently the largest single category of investment in electricity generation, according to the IEA. It expects $500 billion this year, not far short of the sum being put into upstream oil and gas. Installed capacity is doubling every 3 years. Solar power is on track to generate more electricity than all the world's nuclear power plants by 2026, and its wind turbines by 2027. And its dams in 2028, and its gas-fired power plants in 2030, and its coal-fired ones by 2032. In an IEA scenario which provides net zero carbon dioxide emissions by the middle of the century, solar energy becomes humankind's largest source of primary energy, not just electricity, by the 2040s. Because the sun doesn't shine 24/7, batteries are needed. EVs have dominated the lithium narrative the last few years, but energy storage solutions is becoming an increasingly important demand driver, in particular as the cost of cells have fallen so much. Rodney has been outlier bullish on ESS, and as with our recent interview on copper with Paul Gate, has prepared a list of detailed questions to tease out this thesis with Morgan. So before we begin, just if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and let us know what other topics you might like us to cover in future Rockstock Channel episodes. And with that, Rodney, go ahead and chat with Morgan.
Great. Morgan, thanks so much for coming on. If we can start, if you could just give us some sort of a history and a background on the evolution of solar.
Thanks very much for the question. Thanks for having me on your terrific podcast. I understand that a lot of your listeners are investors and very familiar with the mining and mineral space. And we're talking today about one sector that's requiring those things. The solar energy story is making The Economist these days. So it was a niche story for a very long time, for many decades, starting in the 50s, Bell Labs, photovoltaics. Photovoltaics are solar panels. It's called photovoltaics because of the photovoltaic. effect in 1921, I believe. Albert Einstein won the Nobel Prize for the effect that explains the creation of electricity in solar panels by the particle wave duality. And for a long time, we saw the panels either being in very, very niche markets like space, satellites, or maybe moving a couple decades forward into remote villages and housing. But in the last 10 years anyway, the growth has been absolutely tremendous. And that's why you're seeing articles in The Economist on it. You don't see that otherwise. The development, the R&D of solar energy, solar electricity, really started in the United States, and then the policy formation and investment turned to Japan for some time, and then to Germany, and then most recently, say in the last 5-10 years, to China, who has worked to improve not just the efficiency of the panels themselves, but in the manufacturing process. And that's why we saw tremendous price drops for solar power, and thus the enormous growth in solar power. And so just yesterday, so we're filming this in late August of 2024, just yesterday, the International Energy Agency showed that for the first time ever, solar power overtook coal as the world's largest electricity generating technology. So you're in a completely new paradigm, and a very exciting one. And as we're saying, we're looking at a technology that is doubling every few years. And so when you get to that level of growth, it's pretty hard to predict what happens next.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're well aware of the perils of that. So is it fair to say then that quite a lot of the IP in terms of the improvement and efficiency is now sitting with China?
So it's not really a matter of IP per se. So China dominates the global solar market. They produce somewhere on the order of 75 to 80% of solar panels. So if you're sitting in the United States and you have solar panels producing electricity on your roof, they're likely Chinese. That has not really been an issue. The quality has been excellent. They've been driving down costs, as I've said, considerably. And the quality and efficiency of those panels are very good. And so what's happened more recently and why we are talking about China is more to do with the political situation between the United States and China. So the ongoing trade war, or whatever nomenclature you want to ascribe to that. But China worked very hard over the last decade to produce these solar panels at a very, very reasonable and low cost, and thus their domination of the global market. So it's not a very complicated story. It's that they put a lot of emphasis, investment, and they had good tech into a forward-looking sector and ended up winning. So that's sort of the story of the Chinese. It's not a story of IP or some kind of complicated trade, or it's not all that complicated at all. Actually, they just had the wherewithal to decide to invest in this a decade or 2 decades ago.
And Morgan, I guess they've displaced some other manufacturers elsewhere in the world, and we have entered an environment where people are looking to impose tariffs and so on. Does that in any way cause an increased risk in derailing the growth if there's sort of synthetic costs and tariffs added in here?
Yeah. So some of the tariffs you're talking about, the tariffs you're alluding to are mainly American. There are some tariffs that are aimed at Chinese products in the European Union, but what you're alluding to is primarily a U.S. perspective on this. So again, this goes back to politics. The United States is currently embroiled in a trade war with China, all kinds of different areas, not just solar energy. Of course, your listeners are well aware that yesterday there were export controls put on antimony, and earlier in the year, gallium and germanium and antimony all happen to be used in certain kind of solar panels, as an aside. Um, but there is a huge capacity in China to produce these panels. And so if they are stopped or limited or constrained from coming to the United States or possibly Europe, then naturally they would go to other parts of the world. That's likely not a bad thing. In other words, if we can get cheap, relatively cheap technology for power generation to, say, sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and other places, then that's probably where the panels will flow. The tariff situation in the United States, of course, is very complicated and very political again. So it has something to do with content and something to do with politics, with the politics playing a much larger role. It remains to be seen, of course, what that means. Most recently, the investments in the U.S., say from the program office, at the Department of Energy, put a huge conditional loan for a Korean company to start producing, I think, in the southeast part of the United States, maybe Georgia. And so you're seeing part of that IRA money go into domestic production of solar panels in the United States. That's a political judgment. It has to do with bringing back jobs. It has to do with this America First set of policies. It has to do with industrial policy in the U.S. Those things are never optimal from a global perspective. They are not done to be optimal from a global perspective. And so that's the sort of trend you're seeing in the United States. And that's the sort of dominant narrative of this US-China angst.
Okay. And just on a slightly different angle. So, the wind can blow 24/7 if the conditions are right. Sun is restricted to the hours around midday. Can this impact? I often see charts of, I think they call it the duck curve. Can solar plus energy storage batteries balance the grid cost effectively, or is there going to be some sort of a limit as to the kind of market share or total output perspective that will kind of cap where solar can get to?
Yeah, sure. So look, that discussion about variability in solar resources and wind resources, of course, the wind doesn't blow 24/7, has been going on for 30 years now. So different power system operators and utilities around the world struggled. Say 20 years ago, the big discussion was all about how much of this stuff can we take on the grid? It's going to knock off our grid. We're going to lose reliability, et cetera. It turns out that the power system engineers are very good at what they do, and the systems can be operated with very high percentages of variable renewables. I think the National Renewable Energy Lab here, very close to where I'm sitting, put out, roughly that 80% was pretty doable. And that report, which is roughly 1,000 pages long, was done, I think, 10 years ago now. So, that narrative goes on and on and on. Does it have an impact? Yes, you have to change how you operate a system when you have high levels of variable power generation. Yes, the fact that batteries have come down in price so much makes a huge benefit to this discussion. And you're seeing some jurisdictions like California, and I guess some places in Australia, et cetera, using enormous amounts of battery backup. It turns out that right now, those systems in certain kinds of markets, with certain kinds of pricing, with certain kinds of regulation, um, can be very, very competitive. And in depending again on the type of electricity market you have and the rules within, you're starting to see, people are starting to pay attention to negative pricing and all kinds of other things. In any case, when you have a certain kind of electricity market that clears on marginal cost, you will see that the prices are depressed. So the prices are lower from having lots of renewable energy on those systems, especially with the battery backup. So, that kind of discussion continues, but it's it's no longer sort of the right question. So academics always say that. The question now are more about um, to what level are these storage batteries going to be used, and how do you create the regulatory frameworks and electricity market structures to enable them, as opposed to something else. So if we started this session and we said solar energy is now the largest global technology producing electricity, um, then the kind of conversations that make it seem like it's a niche market or alternative energy are passe.
I suppose there is a question then around if there is scope, for massive market share for solar. Is there any kind of a raw material supply chain potential issue, or is the supply chain good to go to see this, doubling every 3 years, or this high compound rate?
Yeah. So, okay. So that kind of rate of growth won't continue forever. Uh, but right now, the incentives and the price structures and some of the overcapacity issues of manufacturing make it so that it's doable. So there's not been significant supply chain constraints for materials. Rather, to date, eventually, you might see some constraints on in certain kinds of technologies and certain kinds of markets, say around silver or access to the kind of silicon products they need, or even sand and glass, or further down the power system into copper, which I know you've covered and your listeners know a lot about. Um, I think the constraints you're going to see in this market are more around um, financial viability of the companies, how trade constraints emerge, not just between the United States and China, but other countries, where the excess capacity or the product from China goes to. We've touched on that a little bit, and those kind of things. So you will see some resource constraints. I alluded to the germanium, antimony, gallium export controls that the Chinese have put on. Right now, those export controls are not terribly onerous. They're not creating any real hardships. But in specific markets and specific applications, say like satellite solar panels, which are a tiny, tiny fraction of the market for solar products. Yes, if those export controls become really tight, um, you could see some resource constraints. I don't think that resource constraints are the thing that are going to materially, okay, pun intended, affect the solar market. It's going to be things like politics, like trade, workforce issues, quality of installation and sales issues, and those kind of things. So we don't have to harken back so long. If you go back to the late 70s or 80s, the solar thermal market, so where you create fluid water, hot water from solar panels, uh, um, sort of died an untimely death. There was no technical issue. It's a matter of putting up a copper plate and painting it black. But the sales and the O&M and the um, service and sort of the bad reputation that came from some of the poor practices in the industry killed that market, not some kind of lack of copper or black paint.
And Morgan, in terms of, I know in my old homeland, South Africa, connecting to the grid was an issue. Is that something that you see around the globe in terms of age and complexity and how grids are set up, being able to connect renewables into the grid?
Oh yeah, sure. So look, we've been talking about solar energy. If we want to widen the lens into the power system, you have a couple things that are happening now that are paradigm shifting. The main one is that in OECD countries and wealthy countries, you're seeing for the first time in decades a rise in electricity demand. So that electricity demand in OECD countries has been flat or even declining for a very long time. And we're now seeing that change. That has to do with these push towards electrify everything, which is a push from on the sort of energy transition climate side. You also have in the news constantly, including The Economist, into the demand from AI or Bitcoin or these other pieces of electricity demand, data centers, et cetera. So, but the fact that you're seeing a rise in demand is fundamentally different than what we've seen for the last decades. And so that will have a huge impact on power systems going forward and how utilities think of their business models and how they prepare for that. In markets like South Africa, well, and parts of OECD, many parts of OECD countries, sure, we have a huge queue in the United States for getting projects onto grids and how you permit and get social license and put up huge infrastructure like high voltage transmission systems has been and remains a, a, a huge challenge. And one of those challenges that will limit growth much more considerably than any resource constraint will. So that remains a very salient concern in all markets, essentially. So, but that has to do more with a wider set of constraints, not just solar energy.
On that note, so China, put out its kind of forecasts of when they would decarbonize or do the shift in their grid. It looks as if you looked at the amount of solar that they did in 2023 alone and the capacity that they have to produce solar panels at home, my theory is that they are going to clean up their grid well before the previously stated target dates. Your thoughts on the sort of timelines of when China can make major shifts?
Well, China has put up and continues to put up and install far more renewable energy than anywhere else. Will it completely displace coal? No, not in the short term. I mean, what you're seeing is, at least globally, you're seeing a rise in all of these technologies. Solar's just happens, the topic we've been discussing so far happens to be rising more quickly. So it's accelerating more quickly, but you're still seeing coal and gas and well, not quite oil and the liquid fuels, but certainly coal and gas still maintaining growth. It's just that their growth is slower. There's some analogies to the discussions I have around critical minerals to the discussion around solar energy because of China. And so, I often get the question, well, how can the United States, the United States loves to dominate things. how can the United States dominate this market, or how do we catch up with China on critical minerals, which you guys cover all the time, or solar energy? Well, it's not like they decided yesterday to that this was an important issue. They've been planning this for decades, and they've been making investments all over the world on the critical mineral side, and they've been putting together a hugely robust industry on the solar side. um, yes, it has issues. Yes, there was cheap government capital put into it. Yes, there's probably overcapacity. Yes, there are human rights violations, likely in Xinjiang. Yes, solar panels are, to the extent, or at least ignits or silicon, being produced with coal um, fire generation. So, there's no shortage of issues, but um, the fact that they made a long-term commitment to these sectors has proven out that that's how you get to this sort of domination of the space, not through short-term, uncertain policies and investment.
Just looking out into the future, Morgan, are there any alternative technologies that could potentially displace solar, or is solar, wind, and so on? Are these going to be the technologies over the next, say, decade?
I don't like to answer that question as posed, because it assumes that everything is a technology. So if you think of the power system or global energy system solely in terms of technology, you're missing an enormous amount. These are fundamentally socio-technical systems. They have to do with all kinds of complex interactions between technologies and society, from communities to politics to everything else. I'm afraid we don't optimize our societies from a purely mathematical perspective. And thus, sure, there could be some black swan technologies that come out and save the world. We've been talking about fusion for a long time. Maybe there'll be this renaissance and fission will happen. But when you see a technology doubling every few years, at least you can say it's on the rise, and I don't see it dropping off substantially, and I don't see, of course, I have no idea what the black swan things might happen, but at least in the time being, it's making a pretty strong play to be one of the dominant sources of power generation going forward.
In terms of cost savings or scale efficiencies, is there any more, sort of leaps in on those fronts for solar, or is most of it already been achieved?
At the module level, which is, some percentage of the cost, or even the cell level, which is a smaller percentage of the cost of the solar panel, it can't go too much lower. I mean, you've seen this logarithmic decline in price over the last decade or 2 decades. It, it's not going to go below zero. In other words, you're not going to see negative manufacturing prices. So certainly that drop will slow. But that's not really the important number. The important number is how these things get paid and how they're supported once they get into the power system. So it matters greatly how you architect your electricity markets and your electricity market regulations and your markets, day ahead, on day, forward markets, et cetera, and the policies that go with it, to see what you'll actually be paying for these things. And so I think that's where you're going to see some innovations going forward, on the price issue, more than, uh, you know, China's helped get the world to extremely low prices based on manufacturing innovations. Um, so I, it doesn't. The new innovations in price will happen on the implementation side, on the deployment side, on the market side, as opposed to just the straight tech innovation. Of course, there is discussions about different kinds of technology you can use for solar, and will you have perovskites and these kind of organic cells and all this. Look, yes, those things are viable from a physics perspective. They've also been in R&D for decades, and every month or year you have an article in Scientific American or something about those kind of breakthroughs. That's been happening for 30 years. So I think it's not so much in terms of the actual price or cost of photovoltaics anymore, but how you're going to move that to deployment and all that means. Will the companies be investable? Will they, for a while in the United States, of course, as your listeners know, all the solar companies went bankrupt. That wasn't because the technology was bad. That was because their management was no good and the market was not ready for it. So, you see a maturation in these companies and natural aggregation or M&A in the sector. And you're going to come up against some issues like overcapacity in China, and possible overcapacity in the United States even. Uh, for these that'll have a much more material impact on the future of solar, but it doesn't seem like it's going away.
Okay, and Morgan, I wanted to ask. I know from a battery cell perspective, it's become important recycling of used solar panels. Is that where it should be, or can there be improvements, or where are things at on that front?
Yeah, the recycling side for solar is abysmal, at least in the United States and most other jurisdictions. Um, you do have much better levels of recycling in general of these things in Asia, including batteries, as you know, and so you tend to get better recycling rates where you have manufacturing. So where you have advanced manufacturing. And so that has been in the areas we're talking about in batteries and solar, primarily in Asia. It's slowly, I think, going to get more attention and get better in the United States, but it requires an enormous leap. Uh, uh, Not only to recycle for content and for the technologies, but just for environmental grounds. And right now, those regulations and policies are, well, lacking.
My last question, Morgan, is on, for us, we see, battery energy storage linked to solar being a substantial market, for lithium. In your view, will governments, as solar increases its market share, are we likely to see some form of legislation requiring greater battery backup to pair with those installations?
It depends greatly. So power systems are not homogeneous around the world, and each jurisdiction, even sub-jurisdictions, have very, very different rules and regulations and operations. Not operations in terms of keeping frequency stable, but in terms of what gets dispatched and how, et cetera. So those rules are going to be written in 1,000 different jurisdictions. And so the answer to your question is there'll be 1,000 different answers to your question. When you do have, say, open competition for the cheapest power that you can get on the grid, like they've done here in Colorado on several occasions, even going back a decade, you often see, and we have seen, solar plus batteries or wind plus batteries beating out other kinds of generation. And so if those kind of financial incentives remain in place, you'll see a growth in the market. If they don't, then you won't.
Okay, and Morgan, just your critical minerals symposium and the pain, it's a public policy institute, so you're very much immersed. You've seen, Biden industrial policy, and we've had the IRA second year anniversary just passed. But you talked about China having done what they've done over multiple decades, and America's kind of sort of waking up to it, or half of America is waking up to it, but every 4 years, you could have a shift. So, and what you're reading of the tea leaves is not like predicting, who might win the election, but just like the momentum of policy in just the last couple of years, uh, in solar, but also EV and critical minerals. I mean, are you optimistic, pessimistic? Any comments you could make just on the work that you've done, over the last kind of number of years to demonstrate the importance of these ideas, whether it be at the UN or World Bank or testifying in front of Congress, et cetera? Like, just what's your read on how things will evolve, clean energy, technology wise, solar, EV, as well as critical minerals policy?
That's an easy one, Howard. So, you know, look, energy experts, of which I consider myself one, are absolutely terrible at predicting the future. That's well documented. There are academic papers showing how bad we are at predicting the future. I'm no different. And so, I think some of these things have some good inertia in the system. There's some good momentum. So we were talking with Rodney there. If you see a curve going up and up and up, then the first derivative might change, but you're still likely to see some momentum there. And they build momentum in different ways. So by becoming cheap, so it becomes economically viable and economically attractive, they become attractive to investors. So you have tons of investors in New York now and Houston and everywhere else that invest in clean energy. These are big investment houses, not niche ones any longer. So that brings its own inertia into the system. You have people seeing jobs. So certainly some of the battery manufacturing or processing and the minerals, et cetera, that's coming to the Southeast right now. And I discussed this big loan program office, conditional loan to the Korean solar manufacturer in Georgia, something like $1.5 billion of conditional loan. Great. What you see there is building sort of stable momentum into a system. So, from what you could see now, in addition to this paradigm shift where we're seeing actual electricity demand growth in wealthy countries, that demand growth was not there in wealthy countries, right? It was there in developing economies, but not in OECD countries. And so with those pieces and parts of the system, I think we can say, one, that the future energy system is more mineral and metal dependent. That, I had to clarify that because, you're going to have some reader that yells at me that, okay, if you count all the coal mining, it's much more than the copper and critical minerals. But let's just say for so-called critical minerals, you're going to see positive demand in the future in the energy sector. And I think some of the complicating factors are going to be, as usual, politics. How this plays out vis-a-vis China, and where the priorities of populations are. So is solar power growing that quickly because of global focus on climate change? No. The reason it's growing in the past few years is because it's cheap, and it's very doable. It's very easy to put up relatively. You could put up a solar plant in a fraction of the time it takes to put up other kinds of generation. But will there be pushback on NIMBYism and land use and trade wars and all those other things? Yes, absolutely. Of course there will. So I think you see a fairly positive outlook for investment in these things. China's not going away from these markets, and sort of thoughtfully balancing the system would be ideal and will almost certainly not happen. And so, you have to deal with what do you guys in New York call it, the frothy situation, and asking for stable policy is, at least at someone of my age or our age, is just naive. So, but I think it looks like the trend is good for at least the things we've been talking about today.
Okay, so I'll take that as cautiously optimistic. We can't predict the future, but there's a lot of momentum based on the investor base and based on, if solar is cheap, it's not a climate thing. And a similar thing I think could be applied to EVs. If EVs are cheap enough, people are going to buy them, and so far they haven't been cheap enough. But China, that's the big question. Solar, like the U.S. didn't have much of a solar industry. It was a young, new industry, and if the U.S. lost it, to China, so what? In EVs, it's the displacement of a very substantial auto manufacturing base in the United States. So it's going to be hyper political, beyond that. But to be continued, maybe for another podcast post the election. But thank you very much for your time, Morgan. Appreciate your insights into solar. And yeah, again, thanks viewers for watching. We're bringing you some, additional, differentiated content, to the broader energy transition thesis.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.